Hello and good evening, everybody. Sorry about the minor kerfuffle at the end, or the start. We're a little bit late, but I'm sure we'll catch it up as we go. Welcome to Councillor Sharon Briggs from Bury, Assistant Portfolio Host, Assistant Portfolio for Resources. Thank you. To Cathy Oldham, her presence will become clearer in a bit. Jim Wallace, you've not been here. I've been to your place. Welcome to our place. And then David Taylor, I think we've met, but I'm not quite sure. But anyway, so without any further ado, apologies, Susan.
We have apologies from Councillors Mary Watson, Councillor John Bell and Councillor Colin McLaren. And we have some substitutes in attendance. They're Councillors Raymond Dutton and Councillor Bernard Sharp. And we're extremely grateful to those councillors for attending this meeting.
Yes, and thank you from me. I've no announcements at all. I personally have got no declarations of interest. Is there any other declarations of interest? Peter, perhaps? Got fire here? You put an annual in. Okay, that's fine. Straight on to the minutes. Have we all had the minutes and have we read them? Is there anything arising that we'd like to comment upon? So could somebody propose the minutes, please? Peter, which is good. Second. Joanne Marshall, thank you. And then straight into the work programme. Back to you, Susan.
Yeah, we're doing it slightly differently this month and see what you think. I'm asking you to agree a couple of things, or to consider whether or not you want to agree a couple of things. First of all, that the draft drug and alcohol strategy be included in next month's agenda. It was suggested by one of the committee, so we've got their views going to come and talk to that strategy. Also, when we were at the Fire and Rescue Service in Bury, it was suggested that we think about some of those thematic issues that might be of more interest to the committee. So rather than just taking the quarterly performance updates, to try and bring the life, a bit of life to those. No, sorry, that sounds really horrid, doesn't it? Apologies, Leon. Just to try and kind of, get into the real issues that are contained within those performance reports. And so to try and make it the work of the Fire and Rescue Service a little bit more real. So what you asked colleagues from Fire and Rescue to do was think about some of the kind of real big issues that they're thinking through their work. And there's a list of issues that you might wish to, sort of plan into your work programme going forward. I don't know whether Jim or Leon want to speak to any of those topics, or whether members of the committee have got any suggestions. There's a couple of dates that we've already put in and suggesting that we deal with the Health and Safety Executive in March 19 and the Fire and Rescue Inspection Report in June 19. I think those are the right things. Whether or not there are any other aspects of those reports that you would wish to bring forward more speedily, it's up to the committee and also officers to advise what might be appropriate.
I put out to the committee, I think we had a great meeting and a great tour of the facility over there. I would like to know what we as a community get from that facility. It seems obvious, but what's its return on investment? How is the training? How do you track people through that? Would the committee support that to understand? It's a good point to start. What does it do? How does it do it? And does it deliver what it's supposed to be delivering? Do you know what it's supposed to be delivering? Would the committee support that as a starting point for drilling down into the fire service a little bit? I don't know if that'd help you. It might help you. I don't know. Maybe.
Just in terms of a bit of context, obviously we've got the Bury Training Centre, which is still developing in terms of how we use the facility from a safety prevention agenda and also how we train our firefighters. But we also still use our centre in Thompson Street. We have a training centre there, facility. So we can give an overview of training, but it won't all apply to Bury, if that makes sense. But we're more than happy to bring something which sets all that out. For me,
would the committee support that? Yeah. So maybe we could pencil that in as a starting point. Has anybody else got any other suggestions of topics? Maybe that gives you a feel for where we're going. It might be vehicles, might be recruitment, might be diversity. Peter?
Yeah, Chair, in the work of the fire service, you and I both mentioned about the policy in dealing with false alarms. It might be under the heading of false alarms, but I just wanted to include perhaps the brackets response policy to false alarms, or mainly response to automatic events overnight when the premises are closed, which is something both you and I asked questions about.
I don't want to overburden you, and I don't want to get too granular, but given a year, I think as we get the quarterly reports, if we have one item, which is then what we're saying, anybody else got any suggestions, or if you think of anything, just email Sue.
Chair, it's just a thought. I come from sort of like a gas industry, and I'd like to know more information about the links with the utilities and how the utilities can then assist the actual fire brigade in their response times, etc.
So back to, I don't want to overburden you, but again, if we can, I don't want that next meeting, but over the year, maybe that's a good starting point. And anything else you want to feed to us, or maybe Jim might want to say, you know what, I could do with knowing this for myself. I'm happy for you to contribute at any point.
It was only just to say that the new facility, I know, is being used a lot for education of school children. And I was wondering if at some stage we can have an update on numbers and any impact that they've noticed on either false alarms or abuse of firefighters when they go out to a call and that kind of thing.
That probably gives us enough to be chewing on for 12 months or so. Anything else on the work programmes?
Just to note that the enabling reform through a common data sharing platform has been deferred. It was initially scheduled for this month. You will get to see it before it goes to the Gmca. I think there's just a little bit of a delay in that work, but it will be coming back to you prior to Gmca decision.
Any comments on the work programme? If anybody want to add anything in for future months? It's actually filling up now, which is quite nice, really. We've got enough to be doing. Okay, so on that, we'll move on to item 6, implementation recommendation to Kerslake report, which is Cathy Oldham. That's why she's here. Over to you, Cathy Oldham.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. If I just give an overview of the report, I've been asked to report back to the committee on how we're implementing the lessons that were identified in the Kerslake report. And that was the independent review into the response to the Manchester Arena attack, and we reported at the end of March this year. And in all, the Kerslake report made 50 recommendations. And the recommendations address all aspects of UK civil contingencies, so how we prepare for and respond to emergencies. So it allows for recommendations for local agencies, but recognises that in a wide area or very grave emergency, those local agencies will need to draw on national support. And so there are recommendations for the national level as well as the local level. It also recognises the roles and responsibilities of individual emergency response agencies, as well as the need to ensure that those agencies work together in an emergency so that we join up our services to the benefit of the people we're trying to help. Typically, agencies debrief after an emergency, so we seek to identify both what went well, because those practices and protocols we can build on in the future. But we also seek to identify where we could have improved that response and to address those gaps or to strengthen the response. And that takes the form of revising the plans that we have, the training that we do, and the exercises that we hold. And most of this report will focus on the multi-agency perspective, so how we're doing that collaboratively. And we operate through the Greater Manchester Resilience Forum to do this, which is a statutory partnership. In its fullest, it has over 80 separate organisations on it. So it's obviously got the blue light agencies, so police, fire, ambulance, it's got local authorities, Public Health England, but it also does engage the utilities. So United Utilities, Electricity North West, Cadent are all part of the Greater Manchester Resilience Forum. And it includes people like Ministry of Defence and Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government. So that partnership is taking the lead in terms of ensuring that the recommendations from the Kerslake report are implemented both locally, but also asking for reassurance that national organisations and other organisations such as the key training providers in the UK have taken note of what was in the Kerslake report. So at a local level, and I've talked through this in the report, we've set up a task and finish group of practitioners who are taking the lessons and revising the plans, the training, and the exercises that we run to make sure that we embed those lessons in what we do. There's then an oversight group which is taking a role in terms of providing some challenge and assurance to those practitioners, making sure that we are properly addressing the lessons and unblocking the systems if there are problems in terms of resources or difficulties between organisations, then that group will deal with that. And then finally, we're doing a report through to the Greater Manchester Resilience Forum, which has this statutory role in terms of coordinating the activity. So I've touched on it already, but the report talks about how we're approaching a whole series of national level organisations. We've had some information back from the Home Office already about what they're doing in terms of learning and trying to strengthen procedures for the future. We are working at a multi-agency level to where all of our systems come together in a response. We are also seeking reassurance from individual agencies that they are learning the lessons. So if I take local authority, so if I take one of the key local authority lessons, is actually about the setting up of the emergency fund after an incident such as this. And the Kerslake recommendation actually commended the practice in Manchester and has asked that all local authorities ensure that they could set up a fund in that way. So we're making sure that the guidance that we've got is updated to reflect the learning from Manchester and then supporting the councils locally in making sure that those arrangements are in place. Paragraph, if I could draw members' attention to paragraph 4.2, that sets out the assurance criteria that we're using. And there are a number of those. What we are saying is that we cannot act independently of the national framework because in a large-scale emergency we need national support. So whatever we put in place must recognise that. We're also aligning whatever we do with the Joint Emergency Services Interoperability Principles, and that's a national programme of work that came out of the review of the response to 7/7. And it talks about how emergency services will work together and should work together in an emergency. And those principles are still developing and we are embedding them in what we're doing. We are asking that any action is as specific and measurable as we can so that we have as much evidence as we can that we have seriously learnt the lessons. And where a single agency lesson has implications for all partners, we're asking that multi-agency consultation takes place. We're also saying it's not enough to simply change a plan. that people must be trained in that plan, and then that plan must be validated through some sort of emergency exercise. And then there must be a system in place to ensure that the processes put in place are maintained into the future. And we've set those criteria because I stated right at the beginning of the report that each time there is an emergency, so often some of the lessons that come out are lessons that have been identified in previous emergencies. Sometimes that's because of the degree of organisational change and the nature of the procedures and protocols that need amending. So this set of principles is to ensure that we do our absolute best to embed the lessons in what we're doing. So perhaps, Chair, if that's a sufficient summary, and if members have any questions.
I'm going to start with the fire service. Have you got any comments? Well, it's not really comments. Have you got a contribution to that sort of report you would like to make before we open the floor to questions?
I can only speak really on a fire-specific perspective. So obviously, the Fire and Rescue Service form part of the team, so there's been contribution throughout. But obviously, the Fire and Rescue Service had to put in place some changes following the attack from some of the learning that we found from the night, and also following the publication of the Kerslake report. There's over 20 of these actions, but I can give you a couple of headlines if that's helpful. One of the first things we had to do was make some changes within North West Fire Control. So we have, within North West Fire Control, they have action plans. So when a call comes through, they access the specific action plan. And what was found on the night was, depending on what the caller states or indicates, depends on what the action plan is. So there's different action plans for bomb exploded, bomb unexploded, explosion. So I've just given an example there of 4 different action plans which detail 4 different types of response. So they've all been reviewed and updated accordingly. One of the other things which was put in place fairly early on was a communications channel. So before the arena attack, we already had a shared channel on handheld radios, so we can contact colleagues in police and other emergency services and have direct communications via this resilient radio. On the evening, that didn't work as well as we thought it would work, because people were clearly tied up and they couldn't access them radios. So one of the things that's been put in place is we have them radios on constantly open within each of the force control rooms now. So each of the force control rooms can hear what's going on, and they'll pick up that information. So even if people are tied up on the front end, the control operators will get a clearer picture around what's going on with each agency. In addition to that, we've also made some changes about deploying our officers. So where and how we deploy our officers. This is in respect of rendezvous points and standby points, or to the scene if appropriate. So we've made some changes there. I suppose the other big one really is we've rolled out a programme of terrorist training for all of our operational personnel, and we're going to keep building upon that. Because it's a moving feast really, and we're learning all the time from events in London, Tower Bridge for example, and different forms of attack now which we are likely to be involved in the future potentially. So I'll leave it there really. That just gives a headline of some of the fire specific activity.
Thank you for that, and I'll open this to committee members. Has anybody got any questions?
I just wondered, do you do actual joint training with the utilities police? And do you do sort of like these, I know you've used the Trafford Centre in the past and done sort of like, role play, so to speak. I mean, is that continuing? Are you improving that in the future?
Shall I pick that up? Yes, we do. The utilities are an absolute key member of the response. One of the big live play exercises that we have carried out was a reservoir. We rehearsed in case a reservoir dam breaches, and that was led very much in collaboration with United Utilities as an example. So it was their reservoir. They enabled us to use a lot of their land, and they supported us in the modelling and the rehearsing of the response. So we do those sorts of exercises. We also do tabletop exercises, which is much more sitting very much in a room, but bringing people together and then rehearsing against a scenario that is gradually unfolded across the course of the exercise. But yes, the utilities are very much part of that and a very key responder.
Any other questions? So just a couple. So obviously at some point, all the lessons of the event will have been implemented, hopefully. And at that point, I would expect an emergency exercise. So my comment is, when is the deadline? When are you expecting? Are we, I guess after the inquest, which is I think tail end of this year, so into spring, into summer next year, when are you expecting to be in a position to say, we've absorbed what we need to absorb from this, let's have an exercise?
If I may answer that in two ways. So the first is that we are not waiting until we've done everything to exercise. So, for example, one of the recommendations is updating the plans for mass fatalities, and we've already held an exercise to test that we've updated the plans and to validate the arrangements that we've put in place. So there is an ongoing programme of exercising as we go through, and these also feed into the exercises that we would do ordinarily to ensure that people are properly rehearsed. I think in terms of the overall conclusion of all the recommendations, locally we're aiming to have them concluded in the next 12 to 18 months. The only caveat I'd put is that some of these, as we go deeper into them, are throwing up additional challenges. So there may be some where we need to come back to you and say it's taken us longer to do these because of the issues that have come out as we've looked at them.
Thank you. So it'd be fair to say it's ongoing, and just so you mentioned you've got an oversight group. Where is that oversight group drawn from?
Yes, so these are senior members of the Greater Manchester Resilience Forum. So the members are listed in 3.4 in the report, if that's helpful. So Greater Manchester Police, the ACC Assistant Chief Constable, is chairing the group. And then, as my colleague from the Fire Service said, we have the Fire Service, North West Ambulance Service, Manchester City Council, the Health and Social Care Partnership, Ministry of Defence. And that group is formed from the Resilience Forum to really help steer, guide and progress actions with practitioners across all agencies.
So I understand that, but they're drawn from your own forum. And that, for me, is not a concern, that you have a forum putting together a plan and you're drawing from the same forum in order to challenge that, as opposed to drawing them from Nottinghamshire and saying, please come and have a look at what we've put together for Manchester, or even, New York, or really setting yourself some people that are going to challenge you harshly, as opposed to Leon challenging Jim. That's not going to work particularly well. Have you any thoughts on that? And is there any way we could improve, or any way that this committee could help you with that?
Yeah, thank you very much. So this group, it may be the use of the word oversight, really. It's a senior group, so it can do some peer challenge, but it is really a group that's tasked with leading this. What we do is we use a number of other means to try and assure what we're doing. So we've recently had a team from, it's actually another city in Portugal, come across, and they've been looking at infrastructure resilience and how the utilities are understanding risk and responding to that. And then also recovery and the plans that we have in place for after an incident to help communities to recover from that. So we've used challenge like that. We've previously had another local resilience forum from elsewhere in the country come in to look at what we're doing. And we also have used a series of they are still self-assessment tools, but there's one that's produced by the United Nations Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction, and we've been assessing ourselves against that. And then Greater Manchester is also part of the 100 Resilient Cities Network, which the Rockefeller Foundation set up to, after Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Sandy in the United States, to try and support global efforts to respond to emergencies and disasters. And they produce a city resilience framework with a whole series of metrics against which, again, we've been assessing ourselves. So I appreciate those two are self-assessments. Obviously, the peer review was not, that was a more independent assessment. But there are a series of tools and frameworks we do use to try and make sure we're not falling into that position where we're simply assuring our own work.
Yeah.
What's that word there? Recommendation. Oh, abbreviation. Right. That's so. I appreciate that. So, is that scheduled in, or is that ad hoc? The checking, because the checking to me is the key bit, and I might be labouring the point a little bit. But is it ad hoc, or is it we do this every year and we bring? It was Portugal last year on such and such a topic, and next year it's Germany or Australia, wherever.
So there's probably two really regular pieces. One is that learning and checking after each emergency, because unfortunately, the only time we really understand whether all our plans and processes work is in response. So that's the most crucial piece. And I think in the last year, we've probably done 3 major debriefs to understand those lessons. The other more regular tool that we use is the Cabinet Office issue resilience standards. And that's a tool, again, it's a UK self-assessment tool. That one we are assessing on a regular basis. Actually, I want to add a third one in now. So the third thing we do is each year we revise the risk assessment, which I do want to mention because obviously it's important that we understand the risks that we face as a city, and that when we're planning for risk, we do so proportionately and with an understanding of what we might face. So that's an annual process as well. So the resilience standards, the risk assessment are regular processes. And then the debriefing after emergencies, that we do as I want to say business as usual, but I don't want to diminish the importance of that because that's absolutely crucial for making sure that we're updating plans.
Has that generated any comments from the floor? No. So would the committee support something, and I would need to have to phrase it some way, a recommendation to almost check the way that you are checked? I think... Who check? Yeah, external verification rather than internal. More critical verification from perhaps other cities. I don't know how could we word something for that? I'm looking at you, Susan.
Yeah, I think we could maybe, and it would be probably a recommendation to Andy, Bev, and GMFRS colleagues and the forum, so a fairly kind of just have a think about how you might go about this.
Yeah.
Would that be?
Okay.
But, yeah.
Does the committee support that? Thank you. Right. Okay. No other comment. Thank you. It wasn't so bad, was it? Okay. Next item. Revenue capital budget update. Richard. And Councillor Briggs. Apologies.
Okay. These These are circulated with the agenda with draft reports that were prepared for the Combined Authority at the end of the week, and I think they've been circulated with some slightly revised versions. As I say, these were done a few days before the CA report, so they weren't quite complete. In terms of the revenue budget, I think as you'll appreciate, the various revenue budgets are fairly ring-fenced, so transport, waste, economic development, fire are ring-fenced, and we manage them on that basis. And similarly for the PCC and police budgets, which are not here, because they're obviously reporting direct to the Mayor. In terms of the overall budget, if we just look at fire's broadly on course for the current year. The report does flag up the Moorland Fires incident and the fact that we've obviously spended considerable resources on that. We have submitted information to the government now for ministers to consider whether they activate the Bellwyn scheme of support to that. And the position will be that if we get support from government, we anticipate being marginally underspent, and if we don't get support, we'll be marginally overspent. But we're there or thereabouts on the fire budget. For economic development and regeneration, there's some detailed unders and overs in the budget paper, in the detailed paper, but they're fairly small. The bit we have done is to invest the monies coming into the Combined Authority prudently, and actually generated substantial additional income of £800,000 for the economic development side of the budget. Elsewhere in the waste numbers, we've actually had most of the cash deployed on the waste activity, the buyout of the waste PFI last year. So there have been underspends on the interest earnings because the assumption had been that the waste activity would be borrowing externally. We've managed to fund most of that from internal cash, saving money on that side. On the transport side, the day-to-day budgets are in line, but there's considerable slippage in some of the work funded from the earn-back money. So we're showing an underspend on transport, which will be needed in the future. So it's a bit of a timing issue. And on waste, we're in line with the budget. We're picking up in a number of places that there are additional grants coming in, so particularly at 3.6, 3.7 and 3.8. One of the features of the CA has been that government have seen the CA as a vehicle to pass grants to Greater Manchester, and actually have paid those grants to the Combined Authority, even if in some cases the funding will flow through to largely the district councils. So at your last meeting you had the children's money, the 7.4 million, and raised questions, and that's going to come back at a future meeting. But we did identify in that meeting that there needed to be some programme management costs released, and this report picks that up and just releases that funding so that the programme can be developed, the business cases can be developed, and then that can come back to you at a subsequent meeting. I think that's down for December meeting, and we'll go on to the CA as well, so the CA will need to approve the allocations of those monies. Similar at 3.7, we've got some small money for careers and enterprise, and they're being used to fund additional posts within the CA to support schools and district councils. And likewise at 3.8, some further funds, including school readiness. If you remember, the question was raised on the children's work. The Health and Social Care Partnership has made £2 million available. That's got to be routed through Manchester to the Combined Authority because of the slightly strange legal powers of health to fund local authorities. It's got to come through one of the districts, but will turn out, and I think that equally is on your agenda for a future meeting. So we're seeing the grants come through. There'll be proposals to how those are utilised, and a large amounts of those will end up back with the district council. We pick up the accommodation in Lee House that on the same floor as this, but heading backwards to take some additional space to accommodate both partners and extensions of some areas of the Combined Authorities activities. For example, adult education, It's a £92 million budget that's going to arrive next year. There's a range of staff needed to manage the procurement, the contract management, the quality side of that. So we're taking additional space. Many of those funding sources bring money with them for the administration and overheads, so they will contribute towards that. And at 3:15, one of the late things we brought in was the business rates income. As you're probably all aware, that GM's one of the 100% business rates pilots. We are generating additional business rates income across Greater Manchester, which is shared between the district councils and the CA, and we're just picking up at the moment that we expect on current numbers £28 million to come into the combined authority for 2018-19. That the agreement is we only keep what we need, and if we don't need it, further funds will go back to district councils, and that will be picked up as part of the budget discussions. But that's quite a sort of crucial benefit for the GM as a whole to be part of that business rate pilot. We made just over £70 million last year and approaching 60 million for the current year. So that pilot has been beneficial to both individual districts and the combined authority. So I'll leave it there.
Any questions from members? Peter, followed by Tim.
Thank you, Chair. Richard, thank you for that report. At our recent Rochdale meeting, we discussed transport issues, one of which being free transport for the under 18s, which was a mayoral commitment in his manifesto. Does this budget include or exclude that provision for concessionary fares for under 18s? Thank you.
The current budget excludes the mayor's proposals or potential proposals on that. So that is not funded in the current year's budget.
Tim?
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask two questions. The first one was about and I can't remember what it was called, but it was £160 million for the cycling and walking scheme over.
On the next report.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I'll ask my second question, which was about the, on the piece of paper you just circulated now, which is the A Bed Every Night scheme. And that is revenue, is it? Am I right? Yes. Okay. It talks about funding that for a 6 months period if there was a gap between fundraising and the actual cost, I guess. And I just wondered, is that budgeted into future years, or is there at the moment that a one-off commitment?
I think the commitment made publicly is an ongoing commitment. Obviously, there's a range of fundraising going on through the Mayor's Fund, but in a sense, some of that will be into the spring and summer, and clearly districts need to know that there's funding available in the current winter for that. So what we're proposing to the CA is to underwrite that from a variety of sources in the expectation that fundraising will ultimately fund that, and going forward will fund the provision into future years. So this is a sort of bit of a stopgap to give the districts the assurance that they can make the provision and that there are some monies definitely available to meet it.
Before I go to Sheila, how much has those style of projects had over the past 12 months, off the top of your head, roughly?
Sorry,
the homeless issues.
Homelessness. There's a series of projects being run. There's a social impact bond, where I think we've got a couple of £1 million, and government has just provided another £860,000 to supplement that because of a higher take-up of it. We've got Housing First, which is an £8 million project. That's just about starting the procurement process at the moment for a partner to deliver that. And then we've got the Trailblazer programme, which I think is £3.7 million. So there are three big chunks of government money going into homelessness and rough sleeping. There was a report to the CA last month on that, so that's in the public domain, so that can be shared. This is over and above the government funding, so in a sense this is a local initiative, partly through the fundraising, I say, and underpinned by the CA's resources.
So it'd be fair to say it's had about 14 to 15 million, those figures you've given me over the past 12 months. Or in what period? 18-month period?
Yes, I mean, it's
in my
not
mind,
all been...
inception was just before Christmas last year.
Yeah, the social impact bond is up and running. The referrals have been made to that, and the referrals have been more than anticipated, and therefore the scheme would have stopped other than government produce some additional funding. I think elsewhere in the country there have been under activity and under claims on that, so there was just short of £900,000 available to carry on that. The Housing First scheme has not started as yet, so that's we've only just recently, whilst it was announced probably best part of 2 years ago, I would think, by government, we've only recently got the grant conditions and some of the money. I think that's a 3-year programme, so that will be starting, you would think, next spring on a 3-year time horizon. And then the Trailblazer programme, again, is something that is just getting underway. So the only thing, in the sense, that has happened is the social impact bond. The others are about to come to fruition.
So 3 million with the social impact, 8 million over 3 years, which is probably another 3 million a year, plus the Trailblazer at 3.7, so probably 4 million a year going forward is what's committed at this point in time for this problem.
Yes, in terms of government funding, I mean, clearly individual district councils are putting money in of their own into dealing with it, and as I say, we've identified resources to underpin the bed for every night to just support the districts until the fundraising is confirmed.
Right, so good news really. So 4 million, about a year as a minimum, and whatever districts can put into it. Okay, appreciate that. Thank you. Right, and you've stepped back. Stella, thank you.
It's a small point compared with the amounts you're talking about there, James. Look, it's in 3.7, where there's a further careers enterprise grant with about £90,000 for these additional careers. How sustainable is that likely to be? I mean, it's obviously not going to produce much extra in the way of extra staff for very long on that kind of budget.
No, I think we've already got some of the careers advisors in post. There are already a range of funding streams coming in to support that, so this is additional. And a number of district councils and other institutions are providing funding, again, for us to employ more people. And I signed off a grant agreement this week from, I think, one of the districts, might actually have been Bury, to support that work. So it's a sort of collaborative venture, but this is just the latest money that we've got in from government to support this. So this is only a small part of an overall programme. But
you are hoping it will become sustainable, at least for another year or two, maybe?
I don't know. I think with most government programmes, the monies tend to come a year at a time. In some cases, like the Housing First, it's a 3-year programme, but a lot of them are fairly short-term programmes. Not to say that they won't be repeated, but you don't know when you set off how long they're going to last.
So, any other questions from members? No. So, yes, you can, certainly.
It's just a comment, really. Are you finding in Manchester, in Greater Manchester as a whole, we are victims of our own success with the homeless? Be it that I spoke to someone that had moved here from Doncaster because we care more in Manchester than they do in Doncaster. And because of the programmes we're putting in place, are we now attracting more of the homeless back into Manchester, and it gives us the biggest burden to put right?
Difficult to comment. I mean, I think there is a general pattern of homelessness sort of moving into the centre of large conurbations. I don't think it's just a Manchester issue. I think if you look at the growth particularly in rough sleeping, it's in the more major urban areas. So if you look in Greater Manchester, it includes Salford as well as Manchester itself, and I think that pattern will be replicated in Leeds, in Bristol, and places. So I think it is across the board, but I don't think it's Manchester specific. I think it's sort of more urban areas. There's perhaps more prospects for begging on the streets for some of them. Not all of them beg, but some of them beg, and also more provision.
I've got some comments on that, but I'll move to Anne first.
Yeah, sorry, this is where my day job collides with my evening job because I'm head of housing access in Manchester for my day job. So deeply embedded in social impact bond at the moment, and bed every night. We've been doing quite a lot today around bed every night in North Manchester. Bed every night will be for people whose last address was in Greater Manchester, so that won't attract other people in. SIB we're finding has been people that have been entrenched in Manchester, people we've rehoused. Recently, through the SIB, have been on the streets upwards, some people of 10, 15 years on and off the streets. I think what a lot of the things we're finding, there is a level of destitution in EEA and how benefits work in EEA, which is a separate thing because then they can't be involved in things like the SIB. But a lot of the work we're finding is people from Greater Manchester. The vast majority of work that we're doing is people whose address was Greater Manchester. So sorry that I sort of cross over a little bit, but it's just, I think, important just to clarify that point.
So my comment was, I've had conversations with some of the police in central Manchester, that they have, obviously we've got this Greater Manchester issue, and I appreciate that, and we all appreciate that. It's Greater Manchester money, and that's what we're funding. We feel for the other people. In London, they get, the police are able to issue travel warrants, or travel tickets, I guess, to get people back to their home towns, even if their home is, unfortunately, not an actual home. Have we had any progress on that? Is that a funding issue from us here, or is that a policing issue? It's not something I quite understand, but that was alluded to there.
My colleague may help, but I understand some of the district councils do that. Might be able to help.
I mean, some of the charities such as the Booth Centre, things like that, will be looking to see on a person-centred individual approach what it is that people want, and some of that will be about reconnection with family, if that's the best thing for them, and a very much centred approach. So there is work that goes on, but very much down to what that individual wants, and there will be some of that as well from people from abroad, where they will help them go home as well, where that's an appropriate thing to do. So some of that does go on, very much centred through some of the very good work that the Booth Centre, the Mustard Tree, Barnabas, Cornerstones, and the work of those, that third sector work, which is well supported in Manchester.
Thank you for that contribution. Oh, Bernard.
Oh, thank you, Chairman. Just a quick question on the Metrolink, if I may. It says in the report that the extension line to the Trafford Centre is well on its way.
That's the next report. That's the capital report that was.
Oh, I thought we were doing the capital report. Do forgive me. I'm not familiar with your papers. It would have only been a quick question anyway. Thank you.
So hold your horses on that. Note down the question.
No,
come back.
will.
You'll be first in on the next round. So, any further questions on the revenue report? So, on that note, can we note the revenue report? Fantastic. And we'll move on to the capital report. Richard.
Again, the capital is a combination of transport schemes, waste schemes, economic development schemes, and fire schemes, which are here. Each of them has their own particular funding sources. There's not particular crossover. It's a bit like the revenue, where they're largely ring-fenced. Although we do manage the cash and we manage the borrowing on a collective basis, but the costs of those are allocated out to the individual programmes, the individual revenue budgets. The report going to the CA itself is for noting. The revenue report did have a number of recommendations to pick up. This is really just a periodic update, and then individual schemes will come through. Just talking about the cycling schemes, for example, they would, as they come through for approval, they go back through the CA to be signed off. So this is not a sort of signing off. This is really just how is the spend going at a practical level, and how do the numbers follow that. And perhaps not surprisingly, like most of your own authorities, there's an underspend developing on the capital programme in most areas, which I will guess you're fairly sort of au fait with back at the ranch. Yeah.
Catch up with that in due course, I would imagine. So we have one question from Bernard, and then Anne. Tim had one as well. Right, we'll spotted Anne first, so we'll go Anne and Tim. Bernard.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I don't think there's much difference between capital and revenue, is there? The extension line to the Trafford Centre, am I dreaming this? It's well on its way now. and it's going to the Trafford Centre. I can see that, and things are taking place. I seem to remember there was some policy, I don't know how far back it was, that it was going to go over, in fact, to the other side of the canal towards Eccles. Am I right with that, or has it been abandoned?
Certainly the current scheme goes to the Trafford Centre.
Yes, I know that.
There were initially plans for an extension beyond that. That's not funded. I couldn't tell you whether it's in anybody's plans or not, but it's certainly not part of a funded programme. So when it gets to the Trafford Centre, it will stop for now.
Well, thank you. That does help me. And the other one, actually, I hope is a quick one. It talks in the report about a second city route. Is that in addition to what we've got now, which is, I call the exchange route? Or is there another one planned?
No, the Exchange Square route down Cross Street is the second city crossing.
Yeah.
What we've still got in the capital sense are still outstanding bills to be paid on that. So it's still, whilst the line's been open for 2 years or so, there are still bills being paid. So it still appears in the programme, even though it's up and running. But that is the second city crossing.
Okay, before I go to further questions, David's going to jump in on the metro.
Yeah, just very briefly on that, as an Eccles councillor, yes, there is a planning line which goes across the new lift bridge. It is built to accommodate the tram tracks. There is a notional patch of land near the AJ Bell Stadium for a station, but at this stage it is, let us say, little more than aspirational. There's no money attached. People in Earlham and Cadishead have been advocating it to go to Cadishead. That is a lot more beyond aspirational at the moment.
Thank you for that, David. We'll go to Anne.
Hi, thank you. Just wanted to ask a quick question, Richard, about 4.10 around the award of 3 million to expand the electric vehicle charging infrastructure. We all have many hats, and I was out yesterday with some Hackney drivers test driving electric taxis in Trafford and looking at the work around that and what the offer would need to be to get people to start to transfer across. And it says here there's 3 million. I was just wondering if you knew what the cost of a very, very comprehensive charging point system would be and how much more than 3 million that would be. And also, one of the points that was made yesterday is that 40% of people don't have driveways, so how any capital spend can also help those that don't have driveways to charge on the street outside their houses to start to, that if we're really serious about the clean air plan, about how we start to really up our game in terms of charging points so people can consider an electric vehicle and it's easy for them to consider that. Thank you.
Sorry, I don't know. we can find out. I mean, clearly this is, I think, sort of refurbishing some of the current provision and adding some more, but it is a small step forward and certainly won't go anywhere near sort of domestic charging points.
Would you like us to try and drill down into that for the next meeting?
I do think if we're serious about the clean air plan and obviously some of the work that will come out of that and some of the work that's due to come out of that very shortly, it will be a key part of that, as we know that the Hackneys and the pollution, but also obviously with other just the general members of the public doing that. I think it's really important that if we want to make a change, we have to be serious about infrastructure as part of that change. And what the Hackneys are telling us of going, we can't do it unless we can't do it unless you provide us a way of doing that. And therefore, I think it's really, really important that if we want to be a world leader in terms of electricity, in terms of electric vehicles, in terms of air quality, then we have to show that we're absolutely serious about that. And along with, obviously, public transport and buses and Metrolink and everything that goes with that, electric charging points are an absolutely key part of that for the public and for those businesses that want to use those vehicles. Thank you.
So that might sit under transport. It might, not here. But, yeah. Susan?
Just a couple of points for reassurance that the Housing Planning and Environment Committee, Scrutiny Committee, are looking at aspects of the clean air plan and everything. We will get you the information that you requested about the costs of a comprehensive charging thing. We can also circulate you some of the reports on clean air and electric vehicles that have gone to they're part of other reports. But if you think the budget provisions, you know, it might be a conversation as we move forward about the budget provisions in future years that might be worth a conversation with the other committee.
I'm going to go to Tim and then Yvonne and then Joanne.
Thank you. So two questions about the transport capital programmes. The first one is just on smart ticketing. So it says at 4.2 in the report about how the estimated cost at the moment for smart ticketing is 3.1 million compared to a previous forecast of 1.3 million, which I guess is quite a big increase, isn't it? And I just wanted to ask what is meant by smart ticketing in this concept, and if it is in fact a sort of fairly comprehensive smart ticketing process that includes, which is multimodal and is, you know, like a London Oyster card, I suppose, for want of a better description. My second question was on the 160 million from the Transforming Cities Fund for Cycling and Walking Strategy, and I think I remember reading somewhere in the report that the expected expenditure this year was only 6 million out of the £10 million budget. So I guess it's taking some time for people to speed up to getting the bids in and things like that. So I guess that given that the budget next year is 50 million and there will be an underspend from this year as well, so it's 4 million. It's how confident we are that the 10 districts are going to be getting up to speed to getting £54 million worth of quality cycling and walking bids in, and also what assurances we have in place is in that money is I guess genuinely being spent on cycling and walking and not on doing road schemes that would have been done with some other money had the cycling money not been there, if that makes sense. Thank you, Chair.
I'll do my best. I mean, smart ticketing, as I understand it at the present time, is about Metrolink and the zonal fares and contactless ticketing on Metrolink rather than on bus. And I think that's a longer-term aspiration, but I think this is a fairly narrow piece of work. In terms of cycling and walking, I think you're spot on that, you know, as with most capital schemes, they take a time to get going, and therefore, not surprisingly, what's been spent this year is scheme development costs and programme management costs at THM, and the districts will need to ramp up their delivery in the future. It must be said, if you look at some of the other cycling schemes, that they do take some time, and the whatever's called CCAG at 4.3 that's a programme that's been going for some years and is just about getting up to speed some years later. So there will be practical issues with delivering the schemes. In terms of what districts are spending the money on, it's a conversation already going on with the solicitor to the CA about the grant agreements we're going to have with districts. As we pass the money to them, there will be a grant agreement that will need to be signed up to from the districts, and what happens with the highways maintenance monies that go from the combined authority to the district. So there's an annual statement signed by the chief auditor of the district and the chief executive to say they've spent the money on what they were given the money for, and then we have to be accountable back to DFT in that case for that. So it's a fairly light touch arrangement, but yes, we need to make sure it's spent on the right things, but without becoming a complete bureaucracy, you know, because none of us can afford that.
So it's just on the 150 million, what's it called? Whatever it's called, the Transforming Cycling and Walking Strategy. So I guess we need to spend that in the next 3 years. And as you rightly say, some of these cycling schemes take a very long time to do properly. So are we restricted to that 3-year window? So we need to get our act into gear, I guess, really. Yeah.
Well, we certainly need to get our act together, because I'm sure the Mayor will not be happy if we're not getting our act together. But most of these grants are fairly general. Whilst it's designed for transforming cities, we would apply, if we haven't spent that money, we would apply it against another capital scheme and then bring forward the funding. So we're teaming and ladling with the funding so that at the end of the financial year we have applied it to an eligible project. It may not be this, it may be something else, and then we'll release the funding from there to fund this. So It's all designed so we don't lose it. One or two schemes, and CCAG 4.3 is one that did have a time limit on it, but we've got agreement from DFT to extend that time limit. So where government departments have put time limits on, certainly for Department of Transport, they're fairly flexible. As long as you've committed the money, they usually find that acceptable. Some other government departments, and not ones here, are much less sort of forgiving in whether you've spent the money or not. And I mean, we're having a conversation about some Department of Health funding this morning, which you had to, it had to be spent by health, not by us, by the 31st of March, or it goes back. So some government departments do operate, but DFT are fairly accommodating.
So I'm going to go to Yvonne, just as another supplementary. So as a Trafford resident, or could be a resident of any of the 10 boroughs, effectively we've got £5 million to spend on cycling next year. And if we don't get our bids in for it, it may well go elsewhere.
It's not being addressed on a per borough allocation, so schemes are being worked on.
So actually we could put 10 million, if we had a really good one, Trafford, selfishly could put £10 million bid in and get that £10 million. I'm sure, for me, the residents of Trafford were quite disappointed if we as Trafford, looking at Anne as the only other, you know where I'm going with that, let's get that 10 million quid spent in Trafford or elsewhere, but let's get it spent because it's there to be spent, and let's get people on bikes.
There's a governance process for these schemes coming forward from the district, which go through a panel to work out whether the business case is ready. Some of those are accepted as being schemes that can be ready, go through the combined authority, who agree for them to enter, I think it's called programme entry. Then they go back and do more work, and they'll come back with a firm estimate as to what the cost of that scheme is. A number of schemes have been passed back to districts as inadequately worked up and need to come back through the process. At the moment, there's not a sort of oversupply of schemes, so that schemes are arriving, are ready, are getting programme entry. At some stage, if there's 100 schemes arrive at the same time, there will need to be some prioritisation, but we're not at that point at the present time. So I know some schemes are progressing. One in Manchester is a very large scheme. Some of them are quite small schemes, so there's a whole variety coming through. So if Trafford want to make sure they've got schemes coming forward, that's what they need to be doing.
Thank you for that, and Yvonne.
I'm looking at the Metrolink programme part there, and it's pretty obvious that Stockport yet again is not going to be benefiting from things, but there is a mention of park and ride. The closest we actually get in Stockport to the Metrolink is the park and ride at Parswood, and that was a brilliant scheme, and I say was because it's no longer brilliant because nobody can actually park there anymore because the commuters fill it up. And so if you go from anywhere south of Didsbury to try and join the Metrolink, you find you can't park, which is creating all kinds of unpleasantness in the streets around because people do park where they shouldn't. But at the same time in Stockport, we've got this issue of air pollution on the A34, where we've got to come up with a scheme, apparently, by December. How we're going to do it on our own, I'm not quite sure. For, mitigating the air pollution, the government is going to fine us otherwise. The two are not unconnected, If we had the facility of even parking and getting the Metrolink at Parswood, that would take some of the traffic that's going on into Manchester. It won't actually help the bit before, but I think there aren't enough schemes in the general plan of things here which are going to do anything about that inflow of traffic to Manchester from the south, and we desperately need things to be done. Nearly all the Metrolink stuff happens elsewhere, doesn't it? And yet we've got this enormous problem coming up from Cheshire all the way up and going to Manchester, and presumably making a lot of money for Manchester, most of the people who are coming in. So is there any chance of the park and ride there particularly being a high priority, at least for next year?
I'm not aware that there's any further scheme East Didsbury Park and Ride. I mean, there's a programme of Park and Ride, but the money for Park and Ride will then have been used up. I mean, what we've seen that through the growth deal monies, through the sort of historic funding that have come in, but I'm not aware there's any more money for new schemes for Park and Ride to be introduced, or to extend what you've got at Parswood. I'm one of those driving down the A34, so.
And Joanne?
Just going back to Anne's point on the electric vehicle charging points, I sit on the Air Quality Executive, and this has come up as an issue also. We have the same problem in Wigan, that, you know, the amount of charging points is just ridiculous, to be honest. So that is actually as part of the Clean Air Action Plan. So obviously at some point there will be some more information that comes out about it, but I fully agree with you that if you live in a terraced house, you need, you know, the charging point. So it's okay to push electric vehicles, but we do need to make sure that we have got that infrastructure in place to, you know, promote the vehicles in the first place. But there will be some more information obviously coming out with the Clean Air Plan anyway, and that is a part of the agenda.
Any other comments on capital? No. So can we note that report, please? Thank you. So I've got a report from David now, which we're just going to take the report, note it, and then we go to part B, and then we're going to take questions. So, David.
Thank you. As the Chair has said, there's a accompanying Part B report on the waste procurement, which sets out some of the commercially confidential aspects of the procurement process. The Part A report is giving you background to the procurement process, which leads on from the termination of the PFI contract in 2017, the entering into a short-term operating contract with Viridor, the current operator, and the subsequent procurement of longer-term waste contracts. So the way that we've gone about this is, rather than to go out with a single integrated contract, it's to split the services up into 3 lots, broadly based around waste streams and facilities. There's a high-level set of strategic objectives that procurements are there to achieve, essentially to push up diversion from landfill and to increase the recycling which is occurring, particularly at the household waste recycling centres. What we're also looking for is to make sure that we've got a flexible suite of contracts, given the uncertainty which there currently is around national waste policy and the way in which the country will adapt to legislation post-Brexit as well. The procurement process started in November 2017, and the report sets out the published timetable and also the shortlisted bidders for the procurement. So we're undertaking what's called competitive dialogue. That process is underway at the moment, and I will go into further details within the Part B report.
So, slight error. I'll take full responsibility for that, Susan. Full responsibility. I missed section 8 and 9 out. So, I'm going to, at that point, that's Part A report, 10, let's call that 10A. We'll go to 10B in a moment. I'm going to go right back to Gmca Register of Key Decisions, which is just the noting. We've all had the papers. Can we just at least note that, please? Great, thank you. Date and time of the next meeting, Tuesday, 20th November. Here, as ever. That's great, superb. So at that, we're going to go to the Part B. So that, as far as streaming is concerned, Kathy, I believe you need to leave. 5 people may leave if you wish, or you can stay and hear about waste.
And also we're stopping the live streaming as well.